Hey, friends. Welcome back to Unpolished but Called. I'm Kathrin Shaffer, and this is one of those conversations that quietly affects how we relate to God more than we realize. There are moments where something surfaces internally, something feels off, something needs attention, and instead of knowing what to do with it, there's hesitation. Not because we don't care or because we're trying to avoid anything, but because what we're feeling isn't clear enough to trust. It carries weight, but not direction. It feels important, but not defined. That's where things start to blur. In that space, it becomes easy to pull back when God is actually drawing us closer, or to dismiss something that really does need to be addressed. Both responses come from the same place, not recognizing what we're actually experiencing. Over time, that lack of clarity shapes how we respond in ways that don't feel intentional but still affect how we move forward. This conversation is about clearing that up, not making it heavier, just making it clear. Because once the difference between conviction and condemnation is seen for what it actually is, there's no need to second guess every internal nudge or every moment of awareness. There's a way to respond that leads somewhere instead of keeping everything stuck in a loop. Condemnation rarely shows up in a way that immediately raises a red flag. It doesn't usually feel like something foreign or obviously wrong. Most of the time, it blends into our thoughts in a way that feels familiar enough to accept without questioning. It carries a tone that seems serious, even responsible, which makes it easy to assume it belongs in the process of growth or awareness. What begins as a moment of noticing something slowly shifts into something broader without ever becoming clearly defined. Instead of highlighting a specific issue that can be addressed, it expands into a general sense that something is off. There isn't a clear starting point, and there isn't a clear next step. There's just a lingering awareness that something isn't right, and that awareness doesn't resolve into anything actionable. That lack of clarity is not accidental. Without something specific to respond to, everything remains open-ended. Thoughts begin to connect to each other in ways that make the situation feel larger than it actually is. A single moment no longer stands on its own. It becomes part of a pattern, and that pattern begins to feel like it says something about who we are rather than something that needs to be addressed. That shift from action to identity is where condemnation gains its weight. Once identity is pulled into it, everything feels heavier because the issue is no longer something that can be handled directly. It feels like something that sits deeper, something that can't be resolved by dealing with a moment because it no longer feels like it's about a moment at all. This is where things begin to take on a different kind of pressure. Instead of looking at something and thinking, this needs to be addressed, the internal narrative starts to sound more like, something is wrong with me. That distinction may seem small, but it changes how everything is carried. When something is framed as an issue to address, there is movement available. When it is framed as identity, there is nowhere to move because it feels like the problem is you, not something you can respond to. That's why condemnation feels so heavy. Not because there's too much to do, but because there's nothing clearly defined to do. It creates activity and thought without direction and response. There's movement internally, but no progress externally. Everything continues to circle without landing anywhere that allows resolution. there's also an effect it has on how we relate to God in those moments, even if it isn't something we immediately recognize. Instead of feeling drawn toward Him, something begins to hold back. It can feel like there's a step missing, something that needs to be sorted out first before moving closer. That hesitation doesn't usually show up as a clear decision. It sits underneath everything as a quiet assumption that something needs to be fixed before a relationship feels right again. That assumption reshapes how the moment is approached. Instead of moving toward God with what is real, there is a pause. There's an attempt to figure things out internally first, to make sense of what is happening before bringing it to Him. That may seem subtle, but it changes the direction entirely. It moves from relationship into self-processing. And the longer that continues, the more distance begins to form without it ever being intentional. Over time, that distance can start to feel normal, not because it is right, but because it becomes familiar. What once would have felt like something to question begins to feel like part of the process. The hesitation becomes expected. The weight becomes something we carry without thinking about it. The lack of clarity becomes something we adapt to instead of something we challenge. And that's where condemnation settles in the most. Not in loud moments, in familiar ones. Another layer that makes this even harder to sort through is how closely condemnation can mirror our own internal voice. It doesn't always feel external. It often sounds like something that belongs to us, shaped by how we've learned to think, by past experiences, and by the patterns we've developed over time. That familiarity gives it credibility, even when it isn't accurate. When something feels like it's coming from within, it's easy to assume it must be true. That assumption keeps everything in motion. Thoughts repeat themselves in slightly different forms, reinforcing the same underlying message without ever bringing clarity to it. Instead of leading somewhere, everything stays in motion without resolution. The same themes come up again and again. And even though it feels like something is being processed, nothing is actually being resolved. That's where the exhaustion comes from. Not from effort, from repetition without direction. There is mental movement, emotional weight, and internal dialogue, but none of it leads to clear step forward. It just continues cycling through the same patterns in a way that feels active but isn't actually productive. This is also where confusion between conviction and condemnation begins to take root in a way that is difficult to separate. When something feels uncomfortable, it is natural to assume it must be something that should be taken seriously. That assumption makes sense because conviction is not always comfortable either. The difference is not in the discomfort. The difference is in what the discomfort produces. Condemnation leaves things undefined. Conviction brings definition. Condemnation keeps everything broad. Conviction narrows focus. Condemnation creates weight without movement. Conviction creates clarity that leads somewhere. Without recognizing that distinction, it becomes easy to respond to something that is not actually leading in the right direction. There's also deeper impact this has over time that doesn't always get talked about clearly. When condemnation is present for long enough, it begins to affect how we trust what we are hearing internally at all. Everything starts to feel uncertain. Thoughts are questioned. Feelings are second guessed. It becomes harder to tell what is real and what is not, because everything carries the same weight without the same clarity. That lack of trust creates hesitation. Hesitation creates delay, and delay creates distance. And that cycle continues without ever needing to be intentionally chosen. If this feels familiar, it is not because something is wrong with us. It is because this has not always been explained clearly. Sorting out what is actually coming from God and what is just noise requires more than trying to think harder about it. It requires learning how to sit with what is coming up in a way that allows it to be seen clearly instead of just felt. That is why living the Word exists not as something heavy or complicated, but as something practical that helps us engage Scripture and actually hear God in a way that is grounded instead of confusing, and creates a way to process what is happening instead of reacting to it or ignoring it. The book is, and the audiobook, it is in the show notes if you want something that helps move this from something we talk about into something we actually live. Because staying in that loop does not lead anywhere. Clarity does. Condemnation does not clarify what needs to change. It does not restore what has been affected or draw us closer to God. What it produces is weight without direction, awareness without resolution, and movement without progress. And once that becomes clear, it becomes easier to recognize that it is not something meant to guide us. Once condemnation is seen clearly for what it is, the next step isn't just avoiding it, it's learning how to recognize conviction when it shows up so we don't misread it and respond the wrong way. Because the goal isn't to shut everything down internally, it's to understand what's actually coming from God so we can move with it instead of resisting it or confusing it with something else. Conviction doesn't feel like condemnation, even when it's uncomfortable. The difference isn't that one feels easy and the other feels hard. The difference is in what it produces. Conviction brings something into focus in a way that is clear enough to respond to. It doesn't scatter attention across everything at once. It draws a line around something specific and says, this is what needs attention. That clarity is what makes it possible to actually move forward instead of staying stuck in a cycle of thinking without direction. There is also a noticeable difference in how conviction affects our posture towards God. Instead of creating hesitation, it creates movement. Even when something uncomfortable is being brought into the light, there is still a pull toward Him, not away from Him. That pull doesn't come from pressure. It comes from the awareness that what is being addressed belongs in His presence, not outside of it. Instead of feeling like something needs to be fixed before coming closer, there is a recognition that coming closer is part of how it gets dealt with. That alone changes how everything is handled. Instead of trying to resolve things internally first, we bring them into relationship. Instead of waiting until something feels cleaner or more manageable, we respond in real time with what is actually there. That doesn't mean everything gets resolved instantly, but it means nothing has to stay hidden or carried alone. Conviction also separates identity from what is being addressed. It allows something to be seen clearly without attaching it to who we are in Christ. That distinction matters because it allows honesty without collapse. Something can be wrong without everything being wrong. Something can need to change without redefining who we are. That's what keeps the process grounded, because it removes the pressure of trying to protect identity while still allowing truth to be faced directly. Another difference becomes clear in what happens after conviction is recognized. There is movement. Not always immediate resolution, not always a complete shift, but a direction that leads somewhere. There is a next step, even if it's small. There is something to respond to, something that brings clarity instead of confusion. That's what keeps conviction from becoming overwhelming. It doesn't demand everything at once. It brings one thing into focus at a time and allows response to happen there. This is also where the tension we feel starts to make more sense. Conviction can still feel uncomfortable, and that discomfort can be mistaken for something negative if we're not careful. The difference is that conviction doesn't leave us in that discomfort without direction. It doesn't just expose something and walk away. It exposes and invites response at the same time. That invitation is what changes the experience. Because now the focus is not just on what is wrong, but on where we are being drawn in the middle of it. That's also where confusion tends to come in, because not everything that feels clear is actually conviction. There are other voices that can sound just as direct, but produce something entirely different. The enemy doesn't usually come in with something obviously false. He mimics tone, timing, and even clarity in ways that feel convincing, but the outcome is what reveals the difference. Thoughts can feel specific and still lead to discouragement, distance, or pressure instead of movement toward God. That's where discernment becomes necessary. The question is not just what something sounds like, the question is where it leads. If something is leading us away from God, creating distance, or making us feel like we need to handle everything on our own before coming back, it's not conviction. Even if it sounds serious, if it feels important, the direction it produces tells us everything we need to know. Our own thoughts can also amplify both sides, which is why this doesn't always feel straightforward. Past experiences, patterns of thinking, and the way we've learned to process things can all shape how something is interpreted. That's why two people can experience something similar and respond completely differently. One moves forward with clarity, the other gets stuck in overthinking. The difference is not always in what was experienced, but in how it was understood. That's why clarity matters so much in this area, because without it, we end up ignoring conviction and accepting condemnation, and both of those responses lead us in the wrong direction. Conviction, when it's recognized for what it is, begins to build trust over time, not because it always feels easy, but because it proves consistent. It brings things into the light without leaving us there. It creates awareness without removing identity. It calls something out while still calling us back. That last part is what separates it completely from condemnation. There's always an invitation attached to conviction, not to perform or to fix everything perfectly, to come closer. That invitation changes how everything is carried, because now the focus isn't just on what needs to change, it's on where we are being drawn in the process of that change. There's also a steadiness to conviction that becomes more recognizable over time. It doesn't fluctuate with mood, and it doesn't escalate into something overwhelming. It remains consistent in tone, even when what it is addressing changes. That consistency makes it easier to recognize. Not perfectly, but more clearly, and that clarity removes a lot of unnecessary confusion. When that begins to settle in, the difference becomes simple, even if the process isn't. Conviction draws us closer, condemnation pushes us away. Those are not the same voice. And once we start to recognize that, we don't have to keep responding the same way we always have. This is one of those conversations that doesn't just stay inside one episode. Because once we start to recognize the difference between these two, it shows up everywhere. It shows up in how we respond in real time, how we approach God when something comes up, and in how we carry things instead of letting them sit unresolved. Clarity here doesn't remove tension, but it does remove confusion. We don't have to keep guessing whether to lean in or pull back. We don't have to keep second guessing what we're hearing internally. There is a way to recognize what is actually drawing us closer and what is just keeping us stuck. And that changes how we move forward. If this is something you want to keep walking through, not just listening to once, but actually learning how to live out, everything is connected in the show notes. The Facebook page is there so we can stay in conversation. The books and resources are there to help process this practically. So it doesn't just stay something we hear, but something we actually work through. None of this comes back to getting it perfect. It comes back to recognizing the voice that is drawing us closer and choosing to respond to it. So thanks for sitting in this conversation with me. And we'll talk again soon.